Welcome to Lecture 15 of Introduction to Fine Arts. This lecture will center on the early part of the Renaissance, which takes place primarily in the 1400s in Italy. And Italy really was the locus of the activity here, particularly Florence, which was a city in Italy. After the struggles of the 1300s, the plague, smallpox, a big flood, there was a brief return to religious fundamentalism of the Dark Ages. And this took the form of a mixture of penance and at the same time, like almost this opposite reaction of this carpe diem attitude of living for the day. Both of these were responses to all of the tragedies of the 1300s. But by the end of the 1300s, Western culture finally emerges into what we call now the Renaissance. In fact, this was the first time in history where they actually labeled themselves the Renaissance. Renaissance meaning rebirth. There was a self-conscious awareness of the newness of the times. And the term Renaissance is a cultural distinction. When I say rebirth, that implies a question, what is it a rebirth of? It was a rebirth of the culture of the classical era. Europeans saw themselves as reawakening to the culture of the Greeks and the Romans. It was a true reconciliation of the pagan with the Christian. It also marked the rise of the artist. During the Middle Ages, artists were seen as craftsmen, but Giotto changed all that. Now artists were on par with the other liberal arts like literature or architecture, and that meant a higher status in society. There were three important aspects of social change that created a snowball effect, and once the momentum got going, it was maybe inevitable. These three things were economy, education, and technology. First, let's tackle economy. Italy was at the center of the major trading routes. This allowed for the creation of a new merchant class, and they wanted art too. Before, art was mainly for the church where the money was. But this meant a whole new patronage for artists, one that was free from the ideological reins of the church. Art explored classical themes, i.e. Greco-Roman mythology in particular. New wealthy people competed for who could have work by the best, most humanist artists. Then there's education. This new merchant class required education, which in turn created demand for reading material. This saw new translations of Plato and the Greek philosophers, the wisdom of the ancients. In fact, the ancient arts like history, philosophy, science, literature, rhetoric, these were now prominent and well respected. These subjects before were forbidden until quite recently, as the church tried to subjugate anything that didn't relate specifically to Christianity. This new interest in the ancients led to the field of archaeology, which meant excavations of ancient Roman ruins, which meant a rediscovery of ancient techniques and scientific ideas, which led to more technology. New technological advances meant better ships were built. A new compass was developed that was much more accurate, which created more trade opportunities and resources from all over the world. These things poured into Europe. So, like thinking about this as a snowball analogy, more economic development meant more need for education, eventually meant more wealth, which meant more demand for products like art and books, which led to more education, which led to more technology, which led to more efficiency, which led to more wealth, etc., etc. It was a self-perpetuating feedback loop of progress. And classical humanism was the dominant philosophy of the day. Man is the measure of all things. This you might remember from when we talked about the ancient Greeks. The idea was that humanity, that people are capable of achieving greatness in his or her lifetime. And in fact, it's their duty really to strive for high standards. There was also an emphasis on civic responsibility. And this concept of arete, or like sort of a holistic virtue, being excellent mentally and physically. Um, Most people will study in this chapter excelled in multiple disciplines. That's the concept of the Renaissance man. But every aspect of life was influenced by this attitude. In fact, created the foundations for a real transformation of society. The classical ideals in art meant that formal qualities were more respected. We see a return to a true depiction of the human form. And there's also the anecdotal tradition. Biographies were very popular, especially the ancients. But all this created a new appreciation for artists. They became important members of society. Again, unlike in the Middle Ages when they were mostly just itinerant workers, but now artists rubbed elbows with popes and princes. And Florence was the center of it all. This was the scene of many of the major art stars of the day. It was also the scene of the decisive artistic battle to usher in a new century, the Florence Baptistry Door Contest. This competition was announced in 1401, a great way to mark the new century. Each contestant did a single panel as sort of a mock-up for part of their design. The two finalists were Filippo Brunelleschi and Lorenzo Ghiberti. Both were forerunners in different ways. We'll talk about Brunelleschi's architecture soon, but here we can see a difference in depiction, the traditional versus the new Renaissance style. Both of their entries depict the sacrifice of Isaac. The story is a well-known passage from the Old Testament. Abraham is challenged in his faith in God. God gives him this sort of prove you love me moment where he tells Abraham to murder his son. Although conflicted as any father would be, he decides to do it. And in grand dramatic fashion, just as is about to happen, an angel sweeps down at the last minute to tell him, stop, this was just a test of your faith, and you passed. We see Brunelleschi's entry here on the left. It's a more or less kind of traditional style for the time, sort of. Obviously, it's dramatic, and these angular figures kind of heighten that drama. But the figures themselves aren't entirely convincing. Ghiberti's entry, we see a grace and smoothness in the carving. We see these sweeping curvilinear rhythms, like classical Greek sculpture. And in fact, there's a Greek attitude to this as well. There's sort of a calmness about the situation instead of this like melodramatic kind of attitude of the Middle Ages. There's a more like reasoned kind of calmness. This relief sculpture represents the first truly classicized nude since antiquity. There was an interest in the musculature and the body as a whole system. It was also a better constructed model than Brunelleschi's. But Ghiberti's sculpture wins the day, and he's given the commission when he's only 20 years old, and it took him 24 years to complete it. Here is Ghiberti's story of Jacob and Esau. This panel illustrates the use of linear perspective and marked an unprecedented believability in relief sculpture for this time. Linear perspective was known by the Greeks, but since so much of their two-dimensional art was lost to history, we don't think of it much when we picture classical Greek art. But the artists of the Renaissance picked up from where the Greeks left off and extended perspective and optics into a whole new realm. Here are the doors in context. Okay, next we'll talk about sculpture and in particular Donatello. Probably the most important early Renaissance sculptor. He worked in Lorenzo Ghiberti's shop, often commissioned by the Medici family. In fact, here is his David in its intended context, the Medici courtyard. The Medicis were a banker family in Florence. They sort of ran the city on several occasions during the 1400s, and they were a great patron of the arts. Power, prestige, influence, all these things they held, and fortunately for the arts, they also were very interested in humanism and fostered a kind of humanism. Donatello's David was the first freestanding life-size statue since antiquity. In that, it was a link to classical sculpture. It was a nude. It featured naturalistic musculature. There was a pronounced contrapposto pose. And it was an idealization of youth. Flowing hair, naturalistically rendered, delicate features. See the head of Goliath here on the right, at David's feet. David runs his toes through his hair, almost like he's flirting or something. Early Renaissance architecture was a new style that tried to capture forms and ideas of ancient Greeks and Romans. The Renaissance artists measured the ruins of Roman buildings. The use of facades on buildings that didn't necessarily relate to the structural components was an influence that came from that. Leon Battista Alberti was one architect, and Palazzo Ruscelli was an example of the work. There were alternating arches and attached columns, very similar to the Roman Colosseum we see here. And then, of course, Filippo Brunelleschi, the guy who lost the Baptistry Doors contest as a sculptor, was an accomplished architect. We start to see the pattern of people who excel at multiple fields here. This is the dome of the Florence Cathedral. He came up with the plan after studying Roman ruins, and the comparison to the Parthenon, or sorry, even I get that confused, the Pantheon is obvious. But he consciously tried to best that classical building. The dome of the Florence Cathedral was 180 feet high, 140 feet in diameter. It included 8 massive rib vaults and was umbrella-like. But for all the sculptural and architectural accomplishments, the Renaissance was really the age of painting. Why? Well, for one thing, there were new developments in materials. A bit later on, from the early Renaissance, came oil paint, which changed everything. There was also the Greek influence of creating the illusion of depth in a painting and an understanding of perspective. You see, the Renaissance artists made a science out of linear perspective. They looked at classical models. They discovered mathematical permutations to these models. And these permutations allowed for a very compelling illusion of depth. This system perfectly matched what a person would actually see if they were standing at this location. It involved something called orthogonals, which are these diagonal lines that represent parallel lines receding from the viewer in space. And these orthogonals would all meet at a particular place right on the horizon line called the vanishing point. You can see that here in this slide, all these diagonal lines meeting right where that window is in the building. There's also like the relative position of figures as a depth cue. The figures a little bit higher up, we take to be further away. The ones lower down, we take to be closer. And then there's also relative size. And it's pretty obvious to point out, but the figures that are larger feel like they're closer to us than figures that are further away. The foremost among these early Renaissance painters was an artist that is known as Masaccio. Now, Masaccio had a very short life and therefore a very short career. In fact, he died when he was 27 years old, but he had a huge impact on painting. He was a bridge between Giotto and the high Renaissance painters. The Brancacci Chapel frescoes in Florence are sort of analogous to Giotto's Arena Chapel paintings. These are a series of works that decorate the interior, and this project was started by Masaccio's boss, Masolino, but he left for a more important job, and Masaccio did most of the work to finish it up. But he died before it was fully complete. And next is his most famous scene from this collection of paintings. And that is the tribute money. 8 feet by 20 feet, large-scale painting. It illustrates the humanist theme of the separation of church and state. This was a fresco painting, which was a very difficult medium to use. What makes fresco so difficult is it's a method where you're painting directly into the wall rather than like on top of the wall. And that means you can't really fix mistakes. Once it's dry, it's part of the wall itself. Often fresco painters would use something referred to as cartoons to sort of sketch out the image onto the plaster by punching holes through pieces of paper, almost like what an artist might today, like project an image to trace it. Then they would brush dust through the holes and kind of leave a subtle outlined image that a painter can use as a guide to paint by. Sometimes in a final painting, the traces of the cartoon can still be seen. Bear in mind, the plaster and paint mixture had to be combined ahead of time, and often an artist or assistant would mix a day's worth of work, and that's how much you could work that day, because it wouldn't keep long enough for the next day. So it's a very challenging medium to work in, but a lot of painters in the early Renaissance worked with this method, and all the way up until this day. Now back to the tribute money. As we previously discussed, the early Renaissance saw a synthesis of the Christian church authority with secular authority. And the church still held the ultimate say in matters of the soul, but not in secular matters. And so this story here is an apt reflection of that. The story is Jesus and the tax collector, and it was analogous to a specific current event at the time in Florence, the debate over progressive taxation called Castado. But this story is told by Masaccio in continuous narrative, which is a device that shows sequential acts in the same scene, kind of like a comic book, maybe without the grid. So characters appear multiple times in this painting. In this central scene where the group is, after being approached by the tax collector, Peter says, "We owe our allegiance to God, not Rome." And then Jesus says, "It's okay. We pay our worldly tax to Rome. Our eternal soul belongs to God." And so on the far left, Peter goes and does what he was told to go in the river and collect money from the mouth of a fish. And then on the far right, there is Peter paying the tax collector. It's interesting when you consider some of the formal issues going on with this painting. And these are things that also make it emblematic of what's going on in the early Renaissance. We see a real consciousness of light source as it plays off the figures. We see an intense and very lifelike chiaroscuro. We see cast shadows around their feet. And we see that in the central narrative area, figures grouped around Jesus in a circle. And so they're kind of like we saw with Giotto, there's this engaging sense of depth here in a naturalistic space. Even the halos that we see exist in the third dimension instead of being just a disc behind their heads. The setting features a really spacious landscape rather than a confined stage setting that we might have seen in earlier works. The use of architecture helps create a sense of space through linear perspective. And if you follow the orthogonals in the architecture, you see that the vanishing point would be right behind Christ's head, which helps direct our attention there, but also creates like kind of a symbolic focal point as well. But also in terms of depth, we see a really pronounced atmospheric perspective. The book refers to as aerial perspective. And you might remember us talking about that in the first week. That's a sense of depth that is concerned with the amount of contrast that gets lost with distance. And as the light waves have to travel through more atmosphere to reach your eyes. If you look at the mountains and the trees in the distance, you can see them kind of fading out so together between linear perspective and atmospheric perspective, it makes the sense of depth in this painting very believable. It's interesting to note that the costumes and setting are both contemporary to Renaissance Florence rather than the time period that the biblical story took place in. And in terms of that, historical accuracy wasn't really important to these Renaissance artists. And here are a couple detail shots of the figures of St. John and Jesus. And here, when we get this close up, you can see the sophistication in the chiaroscuro. Here we see the painting like in the context of the larger wall that it's on. And to the left, we see the expulsion. Zeroing in on that particular panel, we could see that foreshortening in the angel, which is something that is another feature of the early Renaissance that hadn't really been seen before, except with Giotto, of course. And here we can see it compared to a classical Greek sculpture, and you can see that link to classical imagery. You can see that these artists working in the early Renaissance were very influenced by the artwork from the classical era. And here's Masaccio's The Holy Trinity from 1425. It's just loaded with iconography. The Father God, the Son Jesus, the Holy Ghost being the dove between the two. Looks kind of like if God were wearing a collar to me, but that's actually a dove. And we see a lot of inspiration here from Roman arches and the depiction of this coffered barrel vault. And this image was created in Masaccio's head. The actual structure didn't exist. It's an example of trompe l'oeil. The conscious placement of the vanishing point at what would be roughly the viewer's eye level if they were standing in front of the piece, makes this illusion even more compelling. And again, we talked about trompe l'oeil. That's this type of painting where, in this context, where painted into the work is this almost believable sense of architectural structure that if you stood in just the right place would actually feel like it really is this barrel vault opening up into the wall. The people in the scene occupy the same space as the viewer, standing on these ledges, and they serve as models for religious devotion. Likely the models were members of a prominent family in Florence. Let's look at another great painter of the era. Sandro Botticelli, another artist often commissioned by the Medicis, but a very different style. His was a style of elegance and beauty, and slightly in some of these ways, slightly out of line with the other early Renaissance artists. It wasn't so much about scientific observation as, say, Masaccio would have been. With Botticelli, it was more like a poetic version of classical themes, tinged with a medieval romance. Botticelli fell out of fashion and died in obscurity. Wasn't until much later on that he was discovered by the Pre-Raphaelites, which was a later British art movement. And now Botticelli is very popular. This is La Primavera from 1478. And this is Tempera on panel. And this painting sort of embodies moral and metaphysical Neoplatonic ideas, like Plato, like we talked about a long time ago. These ideas were very fashionable in the Medici circles, and this painting is pure visual poetry. There's a deliberate denial of rational spatial construction, like we would have seen with Masaccio. The figures are kind of defined with an outline that kind of flattens them, and they kind of float in front of the picture plane with a decorative lyrical backdrop. So unlike Masaccio, he's not trying to create this convincing scene of these figures in a space, but it's a little bit more metaphysical, a little bit more kind of like the Byzantine mosaics that we looked at. Here's a more iconic painting by Botticelli, Birth of Venus. We see, and again, tempera on canvas, a relatively large piece. We see the west wind blowing Venus ashore, Venus being the Roman goddess of love and beauty. In fact, this painting was based on a poem about Roman mythology. And we see, again, the female nude, which was very unusual even in the classical period, or the classical era. But here we see a clear influence, again, of classical sculpture style. And this matches the Italian ideal of beauty of the time. In a couple detail shots here, you can see the elegance and lyricism in the work. Finally, let's look at an artist from Venice named Andrea Mantegna. He was a master of linear perspective and foreshortening and the use of scale and chiaroscuro. Here, St. James led to the execution. We see again a horizon line that's lower. In fact, in this case, the horizon line is beneath the painting itself. And it creates the sensation that the viewer is looking up into the picture plane. The way Mantegna can sort of direct the viewer's gaze and create a real visceral sensation of direction is fascinating. Here, this is Room of the Newlyweds, a piece commissioned that was the first consistent illusionistic decoration of an entire room in the Renaissance. He like in the tradition of trompe l'oeil, he sort of paints away the walls and the ceiling. In this case, we're looking up at the ceiling, and we see, again, like with a lot of his work, a radical foreshortening. We see 1 point linear perspective where the vanishing point is directly above the viewer, right in the middle of that kind of circular oculus. We see some interesting imagery here, like the peacock, which is a symbol of Juno overseeing marriage. As if the title didn't give it away, there's little doubt as to what this painting is meant to inspire. Here's the Dead Christ. We see in this like an extreme foreshortening again. And there's also the closeness of the viewer to the action. And because of his understanding of how relative size works in foreshortening, he's able to establish a placement of the viewer where there's a bit of a distance between the viewer and the scene here, due to the scaling of the different body parts. And that will be it for the early Renaissance. Next, we will delve into the High Renaissance. Thank you.